Does it matter how you pray? Because right now, you may be staring into the silence, wondering if God is hearing anything at all. You've tried the careful words, the honest words, the repeated words, and still, nothing seems to move. So now the question feels heavier than prayer itself. Maybe it's not just what you're asking. Maybe it's the way you're coming to Him. But what if God was never listening for perfect words in the first place? You've probably found yourself pausing before you pray. Not because you don't want to talk to God, but because you don't know how to start. The words feel heavy before they even leave your mind. You wonder if they're right, if they're enough, if they sound like something God would actually listen to. And in that quiet moment, something subtle begins to happen inside you. Prayer stops feeling like a conversation and starts feeling like a test. You try to be careful with your words. You try to sound respectful, maybe even spiritual. Sometimes you repeat phrases you've heard before, hoping they carry weight. Other times, you hesitate because what you really want to say feels too raw, too unfiltered, maybe even too human. And so you edit yourself before God ever hears from you. But even when you do, pray you're not always sure what happens next. Because nothing changes right away. The situation is still there. The anxiety doesn't instantly disappear. The answer you were hoping for doesn't arrive. And then your mind begins to ask questions you didn't want too fussy. Am I doing this wrong? Is there something missing in my faith? Why does it feel like my prayers are just words? You might not say it out loud, but you've thought it. If prayer really matters, why does it sometimes feel so ineffective? And that question doesn't come from a place of rebellion. It comes from exhaustion. You've prayed in different ways. You've tried being specific, being honest, being patient. You've asked, waited, and asked again. And somewhere along the way, a quiet pressure started to build. Maybe the problem isn't God. Maybe the problem is how you're praying. So you start analyzing everything. You wonder if your faith is strong enough. You question your tone, your posture, even your thoughts during prayer. You try to focus more, believe harder, say things more clearly. Because deep down, it feels like if you could just get it right, if you could just find the right way to pray, then maybe things would finally move. But instead of feeling closer to God, you feel more aware of yourself, more aware of your doubts, more aware of your inconsistency, more aware of the silence. And that silence is what lingers the most. It's not just that you don't have answers, it's that you don't even know if you're being heard. You speak into what feels like stillness, and your mind fills that stillness with uncertainty. Does God hear every prayer, even the ones that feel weak, even the ones where your faith feels small? Because if you're honest, not every prayer you pray feels strong. Some feel rushed, some feel distracted, some feel like you're just repeating the same words again because you don't know what else to say. And some barely come out at all. They stay in your thoughts, unfinished, because you're not even sure how to put them into words. And that's where the tension really begins. You believe in God. You believe prayer matters. But there's a gap between what you believe and what you experience. A gap between faith and feeling. And in that gap, questions start to grow. What if God is listening, but not responding? What if He's responding, but not in the way I expect? Or even deeper, what if the problem isn't the answer, but the way I'm coming to Him? That question can quietly reshape everything. Because now, prayer isn't just about connection. It becomes about performance, about getting it right, about making sure you don't miss something important. And without realizing it, you begin to carry something into prayer that was never meant to be there. Pressure to sound right, pressure to feel right, pressure to believe without doubt. But here's what makes this even more confusing. If prayer is really about talking to God, why does it feel so complicated? Why does something that should feel natural sometimes feel so difficult? And why? After all the effort, does it still feel like you're standing in the same place? There's something about prayer that you haven't fully understood yet. Not because you haven't tried, but because the way you've been thinking about it might be slightly off. Not completely wrong, but just enough to create confusion, pressure, and distance. And that's the part most people never realize. Because the real issue may not be how often you pray. It may not even be what you say. It might be something deeper, something quieter, something happening beneath the words themselves. And until that becomes clear, prayer will continue to feel like something you're trying to figure out, instead of something you're invited into. So the question isn't just, does the way you pray matter? The real question is, what is God actually looking at when you pray? Because if that answer is different from what you've been assuming, then everything about the way you approach prayer might begin to change. And that's where this journey really begins. There's a quiet assumption that shapes the way you approach prayer. And most of the time, you don't even realize it's there. It's the belief that God is paying attention primarily to how you say things, rather than what is happening inside you when you say them. That belief changes everything, because if prayer is about saying the right words, then every moment of hesitation feels like failure. Every distraction feels like disqualification. Every imperfect sentence feels like it somehow weakens your connection with God. And without noticing, you begin to filter your prayers, trying to make them sound more complete, more faithful, more acceptable. But what if that's not what God is actually listening for? What if the thing you've been focusing on the most is the thing that matters the least? This is where a subtle but powerful shift begins. Because throughout Scripture, prayer is never presented as a performance. It's not about impressing God with structure, vocabulary, or eloquence. In fact, some of the most meaningful prayers are not polished at all. They are honest, direct, sometimes even messy, and yet they are heard. That alone challenges something deep in you. Because if God listens beyond polished words, then what happens to all the pressure you've been carrying? What happens to the idea that you need to sound spiritual enough to be taken seriously? This is where your understanding begins to stretch. You've been taught, maybe indirectly, that there's a right way to pray. And while structure can help guide you, it was never meant to replace sincerity. The problem is not that you've tried to pray well. The problem is that you may have started believing that the effectiveness of your prayer depends on how well you present it. But God is not listening the way you think He is. He's not analyzing your sentence structure. He's not grading your choice of words. He's not waiting for you to reach a certain level of spiritual expression before He pays attention. That would turn prayer into something transactional, something you earn through effort, and that's not a relationship. There's a deeper truth here, one that begins to dismantle the pressure you've been feeling. God responds to the condition of your heart more than the composition of your words. That doesn't mean words don't matter, but it does mean they are not the center. And this is where a quiet relief begins to enter. But also a new question. If God already sees your heart, then why pray at all? Why speak if He already knows? That question often lingers beneath the surface, especially when prayer feels repetitive or silent. But instead of answering it too quickly, it's important to sit with what it reveals, because it exposes something deeper than confusion. It reveals that part of you still sees prayer as a way to inform God, instead of a way to connect with Him. And those are not the same thing. You don't pray to update God on your situation. You pray because relationship requires presence. It requires honesty. It requires showing up even when you don't fully understand what's happening. And this is where many people struggle, because showing up honestly is harder than saying the right words. It's easier to repeat something familiar than to admit what you're actually feeling. It's easier to sound composed than to say, "I don't understand what you're doing." It's easier to stay structured than to sit in silence when you have nothing left to say but those moments. The unfiltered ones are often the most real. And if God is truly relational, then those are the moments He doesn't ignore. Still, there's tension here, because even if you accept that God listens beyond words, the silence doesn't immediately go away. The questions don't instantly disappear. You may begin to feel less pressure about how you pray, but you still wonder why the outcome hasn't changed. Why does it still feel like you're waiting? Why does it still feel like something is missing? This is where the journey deepens. Because removing the pressure of performance is only the beginning. It creates space, but it doesn't yet answer everything. It helps you breathe again in prayer, but it doesn't fully explain why certain prayers seem unanswered. And that's where another misunderstanding begins to surface. You've been thinking that the way you pray might control what happens next. That if you could just align everything correctly, your words, your faith, your consistency, then the outcome would follow. But what if prayer was never meant to function that way? What if the goal of prayer is not to control results, but something else entirely? That question changes the direction of everything. Because if prayer is not about getting the outcome you want, then what is it actually doing? And more importantly, what is God doing through it that you might not be seeing yet? There's a part of you that approaches prayer with a quiet expectation. Even if you've never fully said it out loud, you pray, and somewhere beneath your words, there's a hope that what you're saying will influence what happens next. That if you ask clearly enough, believe strongly enough, or persist long enough, something will shift in your favor. And that expectation feels natural. Because when you're facing uncertainty, when fear starts to rise, when you don't know how things will unfold, you don't just want to talk to God, you want Him to act. You want clarity. You want movement. You want resolution. And prayer feels like the place where those things should begin. But this is where the tension quietly grows. Because sometimes you do everything you believe is right. You pray sincerely. You come with faith. You even surrender your emotions as best as you can. And still, the outcome doesn't change the way you expect it. And that's when the deeper question surfaces. If prayer doesn't always change the situation, then what is it actually doing? That question can feel uncomfortable because it challenges something you've been holding on to. The idea that prayer is primarily about influencing results, about asking God to align things with what you need, what you hope for, what you believe is best. But what if that's not the primary purpose of prayer? What if prayer is not about controlling outcomes, but about surrendering control? That idea doesn't immediately feel comforting. In fact, it can feel like resistance, because surrender sounds like letting go of certainty, letting go of timelines, letting go of the need to understand everything before you trust. And if you're honest, that's not easy, especially when you're already dealing with fear, waiting, or unanswered questions. You don't struggle to pray because you don't care. You struggle because you care deeply. You care about what's going to happen. You care about the outcome. You care about the direction your life is taking. And prayer becomes the place where all of that concern rises to the surface. But here's the quiet truth that begins to reshape everything. When you come to God in prayer, you're not stepping into a space where you control the outcome. You're stepping into a space where you release that control. And that changes the nature of what prayer actually is. It's no longer a strategy to get what you want. It becomes a process of aligning your heart with what God is doing. Even when you don't fully see it yet, that's a completely different posture. Because now the focus shifts from how do I get the result I'm praying for to can I trust God even if the result looks different than I expected? And that question reaches deeper than words ever could. It touches your faith. Because it's one thing to trust God when the outcome matches your desire. It's another thing entirely to trust Him when it doesn't, when the answer is delayed, when the direction is unclear, when the silence stretches longer than you thought it would. This is where many people begin to feel disconnected in prayer. Not because they stop believing in God, but because they don't understand what He's doing. And when you don't understand, your mind tries to fill the gap. Maybe I didn't pray the right way. Maybe I didn't have enough faith. Maybe I missed something important. But what if none of those are the real issue? What if the struggle you're feeling is not a sign that you're doing prayer wrong, but a sign that you're being invited into a deeper level of trust? Because surrender is not passive. It's not giving up. It's choosing to believe that God's perspective is higher than yours, even when your emotions are pulling you in a different direction. It's choosing to bring your desires honestly, while also releasing your grip on how those desires must be fulfilled. And that's where the internal conflict intensifies. You want to trust, but you also want certainty. You want to surrender, but you also want control. You want to believe God is working, but you also want to see it clearly. And prayer becomes the place where all of those tensions meet. So the question shifts again. Not am I saying this the right way, but am I willing to trust God beyond what I can see right now? That question doesn't have a quick answer, because trust is not built in a single moment. It's formed over time, often in the middle of waiting, in the middle of not knowing, in the middle of silence. And this is where another layer begins to unfold. Because even if you begin to understand that prayer is about surrender, there's still something that can hold you back. Something quieter, something more personal. What happens when you don't even feel strong enough to surrender? What happens when your prayers don't sound confident, but uncertain? When they don't sound full of faith, but full of struggle. Does that kind of prayer still matter? Or does weakness somehow make it less real? That question is where many people hesitate. Because if prayer is not about perfect words and not about controlling outcomes, then what do you do with the moments when all you have is weakness? There are moments in prayer that don't feel strong at all. Moments where your thoughts are scattered, your emotions are heavy, and your words come out slower than you expected, if they come out at all. And in those moments, something inside you begins to question the value of what you're offering to God. Because it doesn't feel like faith, it feels like struggle. You don't feel confident. You don't feel certain. You don't even feel consistent. And if you've been holding on to the idea that prayer should sound steady and full of belief, then these moments can make you feel like you're falling short, like your prayer doesn't count the same, like somehow weakness disqualifies you from being heard. But this is where something deeply important begins to shift. Because what if the moments you feel the least spiritual are actually the moments where your prayer is the most real? That challenge is something you may not have questioned before. You've likely associated strong prayer with strong faith, clear words, steady tone, confident expectation. And while those things can be part of prayer, they are not the foundation of it. Because if they were, then anyone who feels weak, uncertain, or overwhelmed would be left without a place to go. And that's not how God invites you to come. You are not asked to come to God only when you feel strong. You are invited to come exactly as you are, and that includes the parts of you that feel tired, confused, or even spiritually distant. But here's where the internal tension remains. If you come to God in weakness, does that still reflect faith? Or does it mean your faith is lacking? That question can quietly shape how honest you allow yourself to be. Because if you believe that only confident prayers matter, then you'll try to hide your uncertainty. You'll try to clean up your thoughts before you bring them to God. You'll try to sound more trusting than you actually feel. But that creates distance. Not because God moves away, but because you stop bringing your full self into the conversation. And prayer becomes partial, controlled, filtered. But real connection doesn't happen in what you hide. It happens in what you bring honestly. This is something Scripture reveals in a way that's easy to overlook. Some of the most powerful prayers are not calm or composed. They are filled with questions, with emotion, with tension. People come to God not only with praise, but with confusion, grief, and even frustration. And yet, they are still heard. That tells you something important. God is not intimidated by your honesty. He is not put off by your questions. He is not waiting for you to feel strong before He listens. In fact, the opposite is often true. When you come to Him without pretending, without trying to fix your emotions first, without trying to sound more faithful than you feel, you are stepping into a deeper kind of truth. And truth is where real relationship begins. But this doesn't mean weakness becomes the goal. It means weakness is no longer a barrier, because faith is not the absence of struggle. Faith is choosing to come to God in the middle of it. That's a very different picture than what many people carry. You might have thought faith meant having no doubts, no hesitation, no internal conflict. But if that were the case, then most of your real-life experiences would disqualify you from having genuine faith. And yet, you still pray, even when you're unsure, even when your thoughts are messy, even when your emotions don't line up with what you believe. Why? Because something deeper in you still reaches toward God. And that reaching, even in weakness, is not something God ignores. But there's still a question that lingers. If honest, imperfect prayer is still real, why does it sometimes feel like nothing changes? Why does the situation remain the same, even when you've been completely open with God? This is where frustration can quietly return, because you've let go of trying to sound perfect. You've allowed yourself to be honest. You've come as you are, and still, the outcome hasn't shifted. So what now? Wasn't honesty supposed to bring clarity? Wasn't sincerity supposed to lead to movement? This is where many people begin to misunderstand what God is doing in the process. Because when nothing changes externally, it's easy to assume that nothing is happening at all. But what if something is happening, just not in the place you're looking? What if the purpose of prayer, especially in its most honest form, is not to immediately change your circumstances, but to begin changing something within you? That idea doesn't remove the tension completely, but it introduces a new perspective. Because now, instead of measuring prayer only by external results, you begin to consider internal movement's subtle shifts, quiet changes in how you think, how you respond, how you trust. And this leads to another question. What if the silence you're experiencing is not empty, but intentional? What if the waiting you're in is not wasted, but forming something you can't yet see? Because if that's true, then prayer is doing more than you assumed. And the way you understand silence might be about to change. Block 5, silence in prayer, is one of the hardest things to understand because it doesn't come with explanation. It doesn't tell you what it means. It doesn't tell you how long it'll last. It just stays. And the longer it stays, the more your mind tries to interpret it. At first, you might try to stay calm. You tell yourself to be patient. You remind yourself that God has a plan. But as time passes, something begins to shift internally. The silence starts to feel less like peace and more like distance. And that's where the struggle deepens. Because when you don't hear anything, you start asking questions you didn't want, not out of doubt in God's existence, but out of uncertainty about his involvement. Is he listening? Is he responding in a way I don't understand? Or is this silence trying to tell me something about where I stand with him? These questions don't come from nowhere. They come from the tension between what you believe and what you experience. You'll believe God hears. You'll believe he cares. But when the silence stretches, your feelings begin to challenge that belief. And this is where many people quietly begin to disconnect. Not all at once, not in a dramatic way, but slowly, subtly. They pray less. They hesitate more. They hold back parts of what they're feeling because it starts to seem pointless to say it again. After all, if nothing is changing, what's the purpose of continuing? That thought can settle deeper than you expect because it shifts prayer from something relational to something conditional. I'll keep praying if something happens. I'll keep trusting if I see movement. Keep believing if I feel heard. But what happens when none of those conditions are met right away? This is where the meaning of silence has to be re-examined. Because if silence automatically meant absence, then every season of waiting would be a sign that God stepped away. But that contradicts something deeper about his nature. The idea that he is present, even when he is not immediately responding in ways you can recognize. So the question becomes more specific. If God is still present, what is he doing in the silence? And that's not an easy question to answer quickly, because silence forces you into a space where control is removed. You can't speed it up. You can't force clarity. You can't make answers appear. You're left in a place where the only thing you can really do is stay. Stay in prayer. Stay in trust. Stay in a relationship that doesn't always give immediate feedback. And that can feel uncomfortable, because most areas of life give you some kind of response, some kind of confirmation that what you're doing is working. But prayer, especially in seasons of silence, doesn't always work that way. It asks something different from you. It asks for persistence without visible results. It asks for trust without immediate understanding. It asks for faith that continues, even when your feelings hesitate. And that's where something important is being formed. Not on the surface, but deeper within you. Because when everything is clear, trust is easy. When answers come quickly, faith feels natural. But when you're in a place where you don't see movement, where you don't hear direction, where you don't feel resolution, and you choose to stay connected to God anyway, something begins to change inside you. You begin to develop a kind of faith that is not dependent on immediate outcomes, a kind of trust that is not built on constant reassurance, a kind of stability that doesn't collapse every time circumstances remain the same. But here's the tension. While that is happening internally, your external situation may still look unchanged. And that can be frustrating because you're growing, but the problem is still there. You're learning to trust, but the answer hasn't come. You're staying consistent, but the silence hasn't broken. So you find yourself in between two realities. Internally, something is shifting. Externally, everything looks the same. And this is where it's easy to misinterpret what God is doing. Because if you only measure His work by visible change, you might miss the deeper transformation that is already taking place. But if that transformation is real, then it leads to another question. What exactly is changing inside you through prayer? What is God shaping in your mind, your thoughts, your perspective? While you're still waiting? Because if prayer is not just about changing your situation, then it must be doing something significant within you. And that something might be the key to understanding why prayer matters more than you originally thought. If you've been measuring prayer mainly by what changes around you, then it makes sense why silence feels confusing. Because from that perspective, prayer only seems effective when something external shifts, when circumstances improve, when answers arrive, when clarity replaces uncertainty. But what if that's only part of what prayer is doing? What if the deeper work of prayer is happening in a place that is less visible, but more foundational? Because while you've been watching your situation, something else has been quietly developing something within your mind. Your thoughts, your responses, your inner world. And that's easy to miss. At first, you don't notice it. You're still focused on the outcome you're waiting for. You're still hoping for resolution, direction, change. But overthinking, if you pay close attention, something begins to feel different. Not outside, inside. The way you react isn't exactly the same. The way you process fear begins to shift, even if just slightly. The way you carry uncertainty starts to feel steadier, and you might not immediately connect that to prayer. But that's where the transformation is happening. Because prayer is not only a place where you speak to God, it's a place where your mind is gradually being and that reshaping doesn't always feel dramatic. It doesn't always come with a clear moment where everything suddenly makes sense. Instead, it often happens quietly over time, through repeated moments of coming back to God even when nothing seems to be changing. This is where another misunderstanding begins to dissolve. You may have thought that the primary purpose of prayer was to change your circumstances. But what if one of its deepest purposes is to change how you think within those circumstances? That doesn't mean your situation doesn't matter. It means your internal state matters more than you realized. Because the way you think influences the way you feel, and the way you feel influences the way you respond. And the way you respond shapes the direction of your life in ways that are often invisible at first. So when you come to God in prayer again and again, you are not just repeating words, you are allowing truth to slowly confront your thoughts. You are creating space for your fears to be exposed, not hidden. You are giving your mind an opportunity to move away from constant overthinking and towards something more grounded. But here's where it gets deeper. Because not every thought you have aligns with truth. Some thoughts amplify fear. Some thoughts assume the worst. Some thoughts create pressure, doubt, and confusion that feel real, but aren't necessarily accurate. And when those thoughts go unchecked, they begin to shape your entire perspective. That's why prayer matters in a way that goes beyond outcomes. Because it becomes a place where those thoughts are interrupted, not instantly replaced, but gradually challenged. When you bring your concerns to God, you're not just expressing them, you're placing them in a different context. A context where your understanding is no longer the highest authority. A context where your limited perspective is not the final conclusion. And that changes something. Because now, instead of being trapped inside your own thinking, you begin to step outside of it, Latau. You begin to recognize that not every fear is truth, that not every delay means denial, that not every moment of silence means absence. But this recognition doesn't come all at once. It develops through repetition, through consistency, through continuing to pray even when you don't feel immediate results. And this is where many people underestimate what's happening because they expect transformation to feel obvious. They expect a clear shift, a noticeable breakthrough, a moment where everything suddenly becomes different. But often, the most important changes don't feel that way. They feel subtle. They feel gradual. They feel almost unnoticeable until you look back and realize you're not reacting the same way you used to. You're not as overwhelmed as before. You're not as controlled by fear. You're not as shaken by uncertainty. And that doesn't mean your situation became easier. It means something inside you became stronger. And that strength didn't come from having all the answers. It came from repeatedly placing your thoughts before God and allowing Him to shape them over time. But even with that understanding, there's still one final question that needs to be answered. If prayer changes your heart, your mind, your perspective, then where does that leave the original question? Does the way you pray actually matter? Or have you been asking the wrong question all along? Because if everything you've been discovering points in a different direction, then the answer might not be what you expected. And that realization is what brings everything together. By now, something inside you has started to settle. Not because every question has been answered, and not because every situation has changed, but because the way you see prayer is no longer the same. At the beginning, you were carrying a question that felt heavy. Does the way you pray actually matter? And underneath that question was something deeper. A quiet pressure to get it right, to say the right words, to feel the right level of faith, to somehow approach God in a way that guarantees you're being heard. But now, that pressure begins to loosen, because the answer is both simpler and deeper than you expected. Yes, the way you pray matters, but not in the way you thought. It's not about perfect wording. It's not about sounding spiritual. It's not about structuring your sentences in a way that impresses God. What matters is something far more personal, far more internal, far more real. It's the posture of your heart. It's whether you come to God truthfully, whether you come with trust even if that trust feels small, whether you come honestly even when your thoughts are messy, because prayer was never meant to be a performance you succeed at. It was always meant to be a relationship you step into, and relationships are not built on perfection. They're built on presence. This is the shift that changes everything. You no longer approach prayer trying to get it right. You approach prayer to be real. Real about your fears, real about your waiting, real about your uncertainty. And in that honesty, something begins to feel different. Not because your circumstances immediately change, but because the distance you once felt starts to fade. You're no longer standing outside, trying to say the right thing. You're simply showing up. And that is where connection happens. Because God was never waiting for you to perfect your words. He was always inviting you to bring your heart. Even when it's tired, even when it's confused, even when it's still learning how to trust. And this is where the tension finally begins to resolve. The silence you once feared no longer feels like rejection. It becomes space. Space where trust is formed. Space where your thoughts are reshaped. Space where your faith grows, not through constant answers, but through consistent presence. And that changes how you see everything. You stop measuring prayer only by results. You begin to recognize the quiet transformation within you, the way your mind has become a little calmer, the way your reactions have become a little steadier, the way your trust, even if imperfect, has become a little stronger. And you realize something has been happening all along. God has been working, not always in the way you expected, but exactly in the way you need it. Because the greatest outcome of prayer is not just a changed situation, it's a changed heart. A heart that learns to trust beyond what it sees. A mind that learns to rest even without full understanding. A spirit that learns to stay, even in silence. And now, when you return to that original questandas, the way you pray mata, you see it differently. It matters because it reflects whether you're coming to God in truth, not in perfection, not in performance, but in relationship. And that means you don't have to overthink every word anymore. You don't have to carry the pressure of getting it right. You don't have to filter every thought before you bring it to Him. You can simply come as you are, again and again, and that is enough. So the next time you find yourself hesitating before you pray, wondering if you're doing it right, remember this: God is not listening for perfection. He is looking at your heart, and a heart that comes to Him honestly, consistently, even in weaknesses, never ignored. If this message helped you see prayer in a new way, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who may be struggling in their faith, and subscribe for more reflections that help you grow spiritually in everyday life. And as you go forward, carry this quiet truth with you. You don't need perfect words to have a real connection with God.